I started to work at Bethlehem Steel in 1925. I started at the blast furnace.
Well, when I was a kid, lived on Helner Street, one block over on Christian Street. The guy over there, I'm trying to think of his last name now, Toggart. Mr. Toggart was Eugene Grace's driver. And he used to keep the limousine in the garage in the alley between, let's see, that would be Bishop Thorpe and Christian Street. There's an alley right there. And he'd keep that in there, and he had a two-way radio in there. And we're talking, you know, like the early 50s. Man, a two-way radio in the early 50s, that was big time news, man.
Crazy.
Wow. And then he had another one in his kitchen. And he had an antenna up on the roof, you know, so it would work. And he used to tell us, he says, you see that corner over there? He says, that's the corner Mr. Grace sits in. I says, you mean he only sits one place? He says, that's it. He says, you come over here, he says, you behave yourself. He says, I'll give you the broom here. He says, you can sweep out the dust out of the vehicle or use the vacuum on it. He says, here's a nice towel. Here, he says, wipe that wax off. We'd wipe the wax off his limousine and stuff like that. The ironic thing about Mr. Grace was that everybody who ever talked about him with the utmost respect. So, probably the number one thing that Mr. Grace did in Bethlehem was keep the business in Bethlehem. Everything in Bethlehem.
And in CSL, they had the old timers. I mean, they were old timers. They were workers. They were bulls, you know. And they weren't lazy at all, you know. And they would carry us young guys because these guys were like 55 and 60 years old, swinging a sledgehammer all day long. And one of the first jobs I was over is in the blast furnace, and they're taking out the carbon blocks, and they weighed 3 or 4 tons. Well, I was standing there holding a chisel while this here guy was hammering with a sledgehammer, right? And man, just the sound of him hitting that chisel scared me. I mean, he was going full force. And they were the strongest men. We used to call them the bulls. I mean, there was 4 of them and 2 young guys, so you had to work.
It was an inspirational feeling that here were a variety of people of many languages and different backgrounds, and in a sense like a melting pot, which the city of Bethlehem was, and many of those people worked there, and yet in a common bond for manufacturing a variety of castings that, as an example, were going to be saddles on the Golden Gate Bridge and many areas of industry needing heavy steel castings that were being made in the steel foundry.
It turns out Pete Dent, who was in personnel, said to me, do you realize this job you're going to go interview for was the first salary job your dad ever had? i.e., working for industrial engineering, setting rates out in the plant. And I just looked at him and I was trying to think, I was saying like, no, I don't think so. He said, yes, it was the first salary job your dad ever had. So I went up to interview for this job, and they were asking me questions like, what do you know about it? So I was trying to remember, what did he tell me, you know, about all of this, about piece rate and whatever. Well, at any rate, I got the job, went home, told my dad I got it. And so I kind of think it was neat that in 1973 I started in his old department that he was long gone from.
The old timers were like giants to me. It was, they take you under their wing and looked after you. Of course, they played the jokes on you too. But I looked up to those old timers. You heard of like the lumberjacks and everything being legends. Steel workers were legends.
It all started back in 1912 when my father and mother came over from Czechoslovakia, and my pop got a job in 1912 with Bethlehem Steel.
My grandfather, in the late 1800s, 1885 through 95 perhaps, was a timekeeper. And at that time they recorded everything by hand. As the person would enter the gate, they would record his name and time, and when they left, they would then indicate the time that they left.
But I worked with some guys, we had so much fun, it was like putting a 6-hour shift in on night shift. We made it fun. Well, we got production going, it was going and going and going. We had to talk about baseball, listen to the radio, whatever. That all came later, when we could do those things.
Because it was the lifeblood of this town. It built this town, and these immigrants came over, not only my father, but thousands of them came over. And that's why you see all these ethnic churches on the south side. The first thing they did, built churches. No matter how poor they were, they built churches. There's church of any denomination here on the south side. And the south side market was here. Oh, this was a busy, busy town, all because of the Bethlehem Steel.
I mean, when Father of Lostock came over here, after he got the parish, St. Cyril and Methodius in the early 1900s, went to Charlie Schwab and told him right out, hey, I got something you need. Schwab was like astounded. A priest coming to him, telling him he got something he need. He says, you have something I need. He says, you must need something too. He says, I do. He says, what do you have that I need? He says, a never-ending supply of labor. He says, I can get you all the people you need, okay, for your plant. He says, and what do you need in return? He says, I need you to take, quote, their church dues out of their pay, and I need you to take their mortgage money out of their pay and deliver it to our bank. And Charlie Schwab laughed at him. He said, what do you mean, our bank? Oh yeah, he says, we have our own bank. It's the Gastoni Bank, right down on 4th Street now, catty corner from Tammany Hall. That was all part of the family, the Slovak family that came over. And they built everything. They built South Bethlehem. They actually put themselves into a position where they actually had some clout with Bethlehem Steel. And this was long before there were any unions or anything like that. But that's how tight-knit South Bethlehem was. Of course, that river was the dividing line.
Yeah, oh yeah, I got the experience of people who were 4th-generation steel workers from guys that I made friends with who were 4th-generation steel workers. I mean, these are the people that grew up with this. They knew this was going to be their life. And actually, when they shut the plant down, they stood there and cried because this was their family history. They didn't know what they were going to do. This is the only thing they were ever raised and trained to be. So you learn from these people. And you get it, like I say, the big union family, they're all brothers and sisters. You learn from them.
They didn't have any education. They knew how to do everything. And they knew just how to do things, how to roll everything. And they didn't have any, they weren't even taught. They just learned us by doing it.
Well, you teach them what you know, and you try to teach them to work safely so no one gets hurt. You always look out for each other. You can't see everything. Sometimes you have to warn somebody when he gets in a bad position.
The other members of the family from the other parts of the family all belong to St. Cyril Methodius Church. They're mostly Slovak heritage, and their stories are similar to mine. Some of them came over even earlier than 1895. They were over here in the 1870s. You know, like 1878, 1879, and were mule team drivers. They used to come up from Hellertown. They had iron ore deposits down there, and they were teamsters. They would drive iron ore up with teams of mules for the Sakona Iron Company before it even became Bethlehem Steel. And this was back in the days when they were making iron rails before they even switched to steel, you know, to the Bessemer process.
Going back, I think it was around 1975. Yeah, there was an article from a family in Steelton, Pennsylvania. You know, at this side of Harrisburg, by 3 Mile Island. And they were working for Bethlehem Steel in the Steelton plant. And the man made a comment about 7 people in one family working for Bethlehem Steel at the Steelton plant. And he asked, could anyone top it? Well, my oldest brother got a hold of Bethlehem Steel and article, and outside of my pop, what made him the first one, we had our picture taking in the blast furnace area with 9 brothers working for Bethlehem Steel all at one time.
Everybody in my family worked at the steel, going all the way back to my great-grandfather.
You know, in your department, you don't think about the washroom. To think of all the people that went through that washroom while you were in that washroom from all different departments. And it's like it almost blows your mind. All the old guys that were when I was young, you know, and you see them leaving, and now you get new guys in there. And a turnover, it's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable. We often talk about it, guys that changed in the same washroom where we did. But all the people that went through, just through that one washroom, just one section of the washroom. Yeah, it's fascinating, fascinating.
That not only was the steel itself a little city, but then in each side, each shop was a city. And I love the fact that people tried to bring part of their home in there. They had little guys who ran stores, who cooked meals, and I got to learn to eat a lot of ethnic foods that I would have never tasted. And I put on 25 pounds the first year I worked there with the kipples and the halupkis and things, a lot of things I never had heard of. And for the most part, I would tend to say number 2 machine shop guys will always be near and dear to my heart, because the majority of them were very, very nice to me when I first started.
These guys really looked out for each other. Like, you know, they would tell me, they says, now look, kid, we're bringing in sausage and peppers tomorrow, but we don't cook. Do you cook? I says, I can cook anything. Good. You go down, he says, you clean out the sluiceways at the start of the shift. Your number 1 job is to make this sausage and peppers. And don't screw up, because the bosses are eating too.
Well, mealtime could be fun, because we had some pretty good cooks in the plant. And what they would do is the guys would chip in or bring in supplies, and one guy would be assigned to be the chef for the day, and they would do the cooking. And usually you got to eat some pretty good meals, and I learned some damn good recipes. I'm still using them today. So, I mean, some of the guys really, I mean, some guy went out deer hunting and he got a deer, he'd bring in whole piles of venison, and we'd have a cookout. It was a lot of fun. Again, that goes back, they'd work their tails off for that break so they could have time to cook that meal and enjoy it.
There were no holidays. Every day was a holiday down at Steel Company. They just put X's in a block. You just came to work. Christmas, New Year's, whatever, you work.
Well, the hand mill was really something. Everything was done by hand. Bells, whistles. The guys stood there, you know, and they were all tough guys. Everybody had a chew in their mouth or a cigar in their mouth, right? They didn't talk to the new guys too much, but they talked to us enough to make sure that we wouldn't get in any trouble. And the funny thing about that is, the first time that whistle blew, I said to the guy alongside of me, I said, what's going on? He says, cold steel. He said, follow us. I said, where are we going? He says, don't ask questions. We walked, turned around, walked out the door by the pickling tank, up the railroad tracks, across the street. We ended up in Husser's Hotel. Now this is during working hours. And when we came in, there were shots and beers lined up all the way. I wasn't 21, but they didn't ask any questions. I come in with the guys. We had a couple shots, a couple beers. Pretty soon we heard the whistle blow again. I said to the guy, I says, who's blowing that whistle? He says, the heater. He says, it's time to go back. He says, they have hot steel. And back we went. And I thought, man, this is the neatest thing in the world. I'm going to be part of this. You know, I'm going to be really a member of the family, a real steel worker finally, after hearing about this from years from my family.
But there would be days sometimes you change rolls twice a day. It would be a section that wasn't popular. So you'd roll 20, 30 ingots and that was it, and you had to change rolls again. Those were critical days. You would go home spitting cotton. You'd be so dry, so withered. And there was fountains all over the place, and you never went by a fountain without taking a sip. All right? That's what you always did. But those were bad days when you got a couple roll changes. That was a bad day for you down there.
Monday morning, they come in, they call your number out, and they says, you're going to number 4 open hearth. And a pie wagon picked us up. It was like a truck. They call them pie wagons. And you went in this thing, and you went down from Lehigh to Saucon. And you got out, and there's this open hearth, red hot. And we had to go in and shovel it out. You had to put wooden shoes on and wrap your legs with burlap bag. And I told the guy, I says, my legs are hot. He says, don't you have long underwear on? I says, no, I don't have long. He says, well, you have to wear long underwear. Well, the next day we had long underwear on. And they gave us ice tongues to throw the bricks out. They were so hot. And I learned. And going into work every day, they would be hiring 10, 15 guys, and they'd come down and they'd look in the open hearth and had to go in there, and you see them disappear real fast. They never come back to work. They would lose 10 guys every day out of 30. They wouldn't refuse to go in there.
Some of yous only lasted a day or two because you couldn't take the noise. You couldn't take the activity. You couldn't take the heat. I says, it's not for everybody. Everybody can't be a steel worker. But I'll tell you what, I have respect for everybody that was a steel worker.
But the first job, which is an incentive job, is to be a scrapman on a shears. And that's quite an experience because you have to throw this hook as the crane lowers down. You have to throw this hook on the end of the butt and pick it up. Now, when you get small sections, there's not much to it, but when you get a 36-inch piece laying there that might weigh 1.5 tons, and you better do it rapidly or your clothes will be smoking. And you try not to miss because you got to do it again if you miss.
Yeah, a lot of the older guys in the carpenter gang took me under their wing. They actually took pretty good care of me.
In the beginning, there was some of the guys that kind of like took a liking to us younger guys, where in fact they took us to their wings and showed us different things like that. You know, easier ways, better ways of doing their job. And then of course you had the flip side of the coin where you had the other guys that were just demanding of things that they wanted and expected from their co-workers, and again, especially us younger new guys.
And as I was an apprentice, I worked with this one leader. His name was Joe Stranner. I worked with him for a good 3 years out of my 4. To me, he was like a mother hen. He was like a mother hen to me. He watched me every move that I would make. Hey, Rich, watch yourself. Watch this. Watch that when you're going here. Watch that over there. Watch over here. And a guy like that he's always watching you and taking care of you, you know, you don't get angry at him. You listen to him, because it all helped. He kept you from getting hurt. Now, how did he know? Well, you take it. He must have experienced the same thing going through when he was younger. And he's passing it on to me.
I mean, like anybody that comes in the plant, you can tell on their face they're in pure terror. Now, like I said, they're walking into hell now, and they're realizing where they're at and what their life is going to be like. And hey, you got to show a little sympathy for someone that's in pure terror until they adapt. I mean, that's what it was. I mean, steel company isn't like the outside world. That's a world unto itself.
All immigrants, and they were Polish, Slavish, Hungarians, Windish, Lithuanians, and they all had nicknames. My father was Hunky John because he was a Hungarian. And the Windish people were the Windaks, and the Polish were the Polacks. And there was no thing about, you know, people didn't think anything of being called a nickname like that, and they just called him all the time. They, oh, hi, Hunky John, you know.
Well, we had one guy called Dreamboat. Dreamboat. Yeah, he was a dreamboat. You couldn't tell if he was awake or taking care of his job or what he was doing. There was another guy, Shaky, because he was one of the nervous type of people, you know. They called him Shaky.
Yeah, Evil Knievel, he was a piece of work too. He used to work at the blast furnace and go out and work a double shift and then sleep under the bush here at the main gate. And then the guys used to wake him up to get him back to go in the day shift. And he used to do that every day.
I worked with a guy named Blinky Blankets. I worked with a guy, Mooney. I worked with another guy by the name of Chops.
Well, I don't want to brag, but I was one of the handiest because of small, so I could go different places, you know. And I knew how welding, you know, how to make money. A lot of times I worked maybe six hours, and 6 hours I had my day done.
If you wanted to know what was going on, you didn't do it by trial and error. You know, you found out. That's why I used to ask the stupidest, dumbest questions. You know, why are we doing this? Because you always do it the same way. Does that make it right? Okay then, try another way. See what happens. But you better be careful so nobody gets hurt.
I like working around young people. They got a lot more energy. And by that time, I was already involved in the union, so I felt I was obligated to look out for them. I mean, that was part of my job, to take care of them, to make sure they didn't get killed on the job. It was always important to me.
But there were sections you can roll 200 ingots a shift. That's 200 ingots a shift. And there's some sections where you'd roll like 80 and 90, and that was a good shift as far as tonnage-wise. They rolled 1,400, 1,500 ton of steel. When you got into the lighter sections, maybe you get 1,200. That was a good shift. But you were working more rapidly.
It's a different kind of person, particularly this plant. Being one of the older mills in the United States, guys down here grew up with, if the machine breaks, I'll make it work by hand if I have to.
I knew our guys made the best steel in the world down there at Bethlehem Steel. And for a piece of steel to be in a bridge, especially an old one, that does not surprise me one bit, because our guys had the best qualities down there as far as work habits. Our maintenance force, there was nobody better than that in the world. Those people could weld the crack of dawn.
I had a guy find a basket for me, and it was hard finding a basket because there was full employment. And I finally got a basket from a guy who knew my dad, that worked with my dad. My dad also worked in the alloy and tool steel division. And he said, if you're anything like your pop, he says, I know you're a good guy. So we're sitting down there and we're talking to the guy, and his name was Joe, and they called him Hunky Joe because everyone in the steel had a nickname. And Hunky Joe said to me, Sonny, he says, you only have to know 3 things to do well here. He says, number 1, he says, you come to work. You don't come to work, he says, they get rid of you. They don't like part-time people. He says, number 2, he says, most important, you keep your mouth shut till you know what you're talking about. He says, you don't want to be labeled. He says, as a new guy, you don't want to be labeled as somebody that's not, you know, playing on a level field. He says, number 3, he says, probably the most important. He says, it depends who you talk to. He says, there's union meeting tonight, you be there. We went to the union meeting that night. The next day, I'll never forget this, all the shop stewards in the area came to see me and introduced themselves, and we had a lot of them, a lot of shop stewards. And I said to old Joe, I says, what happened? He says, I told them, he says, over at the restaurant, he says, as they come in, you go see this kid, Bamey. He says, he good kid. First day in the plant, he come to union meeting. He says, these are the type of guys we need. We're going home. We leave soon, he says, we go pension. And they had heavy, you know, Hungarian accents, Slovak accents, you know, Eastern European. And that was what it was composed of, a few Italians, a few blacks. And the amazing thing about it is they had just such a great outlook on life. You do these 3 things, Sonny, and one day, he says, you'll be like old Joe. You go pension, he says, you go down to Sauk and you fish. He says, you go up to hunting camp, you make home fries for the boys. He says, you take the wife and the grandchildren down to Atlantic City, he says. You do all those nice things. He says, you go out, he says, you really smell the roses. But you know what? Most of those old timers didn't last too long after they took their pension. They lived 3 to 5 years, and that would be it, because they worked in horrendous conditions, you know, with the dust and things like that. It just took a terrible toll on them.